With a great deal of honor that I'd like to welcome Dr. Rice to the floor. So Dr. Rice, why don't we start with probably a topic that is top of mind for most of us, which is the recent summit in Singapore.
Right.
What are your thoughts around your optimism or lack thereof? You have personally been obviously very involved for a number of years in negotiating with Korea, with some backpedaling on some deals that were put into place. How are you thinking about this? What's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario?
Right.
What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I look forward to our conversation. Yes, we did have an interesting event in Singapore yesterday. I will admit that when I first heard that the president had on the spot agreed to meet with Kim Jong-un, I thought, oh no, what is he doing? And then I thought, you know, nothing else has worked, so why not try this? And the North Koreans have always had a playbook. And I was, before this, the last secretary to negotiate with them. The negotiations fell apart in late 2008 when they wouldn't admit to a program that we knew that they had. And the playbook was something like this. They would find themselves under sanctions, and then when the sanctions became crippling, they would go on a charm offensive, they'd go to negotiations, they'd make promises, they'd keep some of them, but not most of them. And then the whole thing would kind of come apart and they would progress in their program. That could be what we're looking at again. But I would suggest that there are at least three elements that are different this time. The first is that a lot of the very harsh sanctions that were imposed on North Korea this time, including, you may have noticed, 20 countries kicked North Korean workers out of their countries, Malaysia and others. That's hard currency to the regime. They were running out of military spare parts because the Chinese actually cracked down on that. Now, why would that have been the case? Because when it became clear that the North Koreans were about to challenge the continental territory of the United States of America, people actually believed that the President of the United States might go to war on the peninsula to stop that. And I think it wasn't just that it was President Trump, it was that an American president could not tolerate a North Korean regime able to reach the continental United States. And so people took it more seriously and they did tougher things. Secondly, you have a different leader in North Korea. And some say that, that he is different because he wants to be the kind of North Korean version of Gorbachev. Well, we will see. But somebody who believes that in order to have a legacy, he has to do something about the socioeconomic backwardness of his country. He wants to break out of the isolation. Well, maybe that's the case, and if that's the case, and they believe that they've achieved what they want on the nuclear side, and now they can try and deal with socioeconomic development, that would be a good thing. The final point is that Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, the Chinese will tell you, remembered that China saved his father in the Korean War. When the United States crossed into the war, the Chinese came to his rescue. But Kim Jong-un has no such history with the Chinese. And the Chinese will tell you that they don't have a very good relationship with him. Indeed, when he killed his half-brother in Malaysia, who was under Chinese protection, and who many said the Chinese was sort of an option if Kim Jong-un didn't work out, he was not sending a message to the United States, he was sending a message to China. Is he therefore trying to create greater strategic space for himself? They're 93% dependent on China for trade. Would he like to create strategic space by dealing directly with South Korea, dealing directly with the United States, not leaving China on the sidelines, but increasing his options? That would also be good news. So if you think that the strategic environment has changed, there may be an opportunity to get something done with the North Koreans this time that is enduring. I think it is going to be very hard to get all the way to denuclearization. But at this point, stopping the program would not be a bad thing. They've not yet succeeded, I believe, just from reading the newspapers, no classified information, reading newspapers, they've not yet succeeded at miniaturizing to the point that they can hold nuclear material in critical mass and explode it at the right time. So the way you do that is you test and you test and you test, and one day you just get it right. So if that's right, it would be good to keep them from testing. It would be terrific to get the inspectors in from the International Atomic Energy Agency, because frankly, our intelligence is not that good about North Korea. And these people can tell you things from the ground that you can't see otherwise. So that would be a good thing to achieve. So there would be some good value in negotiations that are orderly, that are systematic. And I think the best news about yesterday was that my worst fear was, because the president has tremendous confidence in his ability as a negotiator, that he was going to sit down and try to strike a deal. It seemed to me actually fairly professionally done. Sung Kim, who's going to be the chief negotiator, our ambassador to the Philippines, was my negotiator for the six-party talks. So he's experienced. So I think Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, and Sung Kim can do this. The president's still a bit impulsive. Apparently, the offer to cancel military exercises with South Korea had not been first told to the South Koreans. So we might want to tidy up things like that. But I can't say I'm optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic. And we're better where we are now than we were 9-10 months ago.
Sounds great. And so I think we share your sort of, I guess, sigh of relief, at least in the first interaction. And you talked about having a more sort of orderly negotiation. And I think Trump's approach has been very unconventional.
Yes.
The sort of the name throwing back and forth in the media is certainly an unusual precedent to a summit.
Yes.
That said, he got the summit done, and so, was able to have the summit, let's say.
Yeah.
What does that mean in terms of how you think, does that validate his approach? And what role does sort of convention, the norms, the protocols have in a going forward space, as opposed to what are we trying to do in terms of driving results?
Yeah.
How do you think about that? It's a very interesting combination.
Right. Well, this particular summit, I think, was a very good marriage of doing enough with the impetuousness of the president to get people's attention, but when it actually came to the negotiations, they looked pretty well prepared to me. There's a reason Mike Pompeo was in Pyongyang twice. As I said, Sung Kim and the North Korean negotiators, this looked like it was pretty well prepared. And you'll notice that the statement was general, which is what you would expect from this. And as I said, the only sort of unusual note was that apparently they didn't really prepare the statement about not doing the military exercises, although the South Koreans might have figured that something like that was going to happen. So this was not a bad blend of those two. The G7 is an example of what happens when you just get the impetuousness and not the planning and not the fact that, and that was going to be always hard because, look, there's never been a greater distance between an American president and the European allies on trade. I don't worry, frankly, about NATO. I know he didn't say an attack upon one is an attack upon all, Article 5 at first. But this is somebody whose first job in government is President of the United States. And we all have, particularly with foreign policy experts, we've got all these very, very careful ways of saying things and mantras that we know. And ordinary people kind of look at it and go, whatever. And so afterwards, when he said, but I did say that I would uphold Article 5, I thought, well, really you didn't, but let's go with that. You did, all right? So I'm not so worried about the more kind of traditional war and peace issues. I think they're doing reasonably well on Syria. They were dealt a bad hand by the Obama administration, frankly. They're doing really well, I think, on North Korea. Russia is in a special category, and we should talk about that. But the trade issues, that's where we've got a real problem. Because I think for the first time since the 30s, we have a protectionist in the White House. I think the only thing that the president really has conviction about is that the United States has been disadvantaged by trade agreements. He honestly believes that trade imbalances are evidence of unfair trade. And as a result, his instincts are to punish what he considers unfair trade. And it doesn't matter if it's the Chinese, who do, by the way, have industrial policies that give them a trade advantage, or the Germans, or the Europeans, or the Mexicans, or whatever. It's all one big story for him of how the United States has been disadvantaged by trade, and that's going to get us in trouble. I heard that he said something about, I don't want to see any more German cars on the road. Well, that's going to be a real shock to those workers in Alabama and South Carolina who are making German cars. Right? So I hope that somewhere along here he begins to understand better that after 70 years of building this system, trade, the integration of the economy, an international economy that is not zero-sum game, is actually a fact, not a policy. And if you try to unravel it, you're going to have great chaos economically.
And so what is the pathway forward on the tariff front? Because there is, obviously, there's an enormous amount of rhetoric right now. It is rooted in some populist sort of headlines that are appealing in the newspapers. And so what is the sort of the pathway that could be navigated that could get us to a potentially better place?
Well, let me separate China and the allies. On China, I think the more important strategic issues with China are around intellectual property issues, around the stealing that is going on to try to fulfill the dream of passing the United States in frontier technologies by 2030, technologies like quantum computing or AI. The whole segments of the Chinese economy that are closed, the problems that we have of the advantaging of national champions. These are structural issues with the Chinese. Now, instead of sort of focusing on those, the Chinese come and say, we'll buy $70 billion more of goods. And that's going to play to the idea that it's the problem of unfair trade, but it's actually not going to do anything about the structural problems. So we're on the wrong course, I think, with China. With the allies, like you can talk about, yes, Airbus is subsidized. We know that. But to keep focusing on unfair trade in an international trading system that works pretty well, and where actually the United States is holding its own in terms of economic growth, seems to me really problematic, and that's where we seem to be going. But the one that I'm really most worried about, because I think it's going to have a real political impact, is Mexico. NAFTA is a fact. Mm-hmm. The day after 9/11, we closed the border with Canada. Within 3 days, nobody could make a car, because the supply chain was in Canada. I was in Mexico recently with a group of Mexican business people, and they said, look, 30 plus years ago, you told us, embrace markets, deregulate your economy. They said, engage in free trade. Said, we elected 4 pro-market presidents. We elected Zedillo, we elected Fox, Calderon, and Peña. Now you say, never mind. And you're about to facilitate the election of Chavez Light on your border in López Obrador. And that's going to be a problem for you. And so the one that I'm actually most worried about is the signals that we've been sending about NAFTA. The dust-up with Trudeau doesn't help with Canada, because the North American platform has been a tremendous boon to economic development, to energy development, and to blow that up, I think, would have real consequences for the American economy.
Agreed. Within that, you touched upon sort of technology. What role does technology play today in democracy, populism, globalization, and some of the threads that you're weaving?
Well, sitting here in the Valley, everybody believes that technology is just good, right? It just is. Well, actually, technology is neutral. And it depends on how it's applied. And human beings have always been a lot better at the knowledge part of technology than the wisdom part of technology. So the same technology that allowed us to split the atom and turn on the lights with civil nuclear power or do medical isotopes is the same technology that gave us the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons. And so the question is, how do you use these technologies? And can our institutions really handle them? So if you take something like social media, I think for those of us who are big advocates of democracy support and supporting democratic development around the world, had great hopes for the kind of democratization of information, for decreasing the transaction costs of mobilization in places like Tahrir Square in Egypt and so forth. And indeed, that is true. Social media can do that. Social media, though, turns out to be much better at tearing down institutions and barriers than at building them up. And if I look at the way, the biggest problem, I think, for democracy with technology today is the way that we're getting our information. Because what social media and technology has allowed us to do is to atomize and personalize our sources of information. So I will date myself. When I was a kid, we watched the Huntley-Brinkley Report every night. Some people watched Walter Cronkite, few people watched Howard K. Smith, but we saw the same moonshot, we saw the same Vietnam War, we saw the same civil rights movement. Well, today, I can go to my cable news channel, I can go to my blogger, I can go to my websites, my aggregators. I never have to encounter anybody who doesn't think like me. You know what happens when you don't encounter people who don't think like you? You think they're stupid or they're venal. That gets really reflected in Washington, which gets more and more polarized. And by the way, I blame us, not Washington, for that. They're reflecting us, not the other way around. And I see it in university. I am a university professor. I tell my students all the time, if you find yourself constantly in the company of somebody who says amen to everything you say, find other company. Because there are two problems with that. The first is you will never learn to hone your arguments because you will just think that you're just right. And then when you come up against somebody who actually says, no, you're not, and you can't defend your argument because you haven't accessed that thing we call data to support your argument, you're not going to be very good. Secondly, you have completely forfeited on the idea that you might actually be wrong. And so I think the way that we're getting our information, not to mention, and let alone fake news and all of that, but just the fact that we're so atomized and living in such echo chambers that I think it makes it very hard to talk across differences. Madison once said that politics has to be constant contestation. And by that he meant that I might lose on this issue this time, but I'll lose 70-30. The next time around, I might win 70-30, but nobody is permanently out of the game. Our politics has turned to trying to put people permanently out of the game. It's become not about differences of policy or differences of view, but I've got to flat out win on every single time. And that's a death knell for particularly democratic institutions which require compromise.
Yeah. And so, as you've mentioned social media, and there has also been, I would say, a grander, larger-than-life set of personalities in politics now, yes. Which, and obviously social media is a much bigger portion of the campaigning and sort of the publicity. What role does that sort of super personality of Trump, Kim, Xi, that is, I think, different than it has been historically, what role does that play in how we perceive progress that's being made on issues, or how does that cloud the issues?
Well, it's a real problem when it's Xi, Putin, Erdogan, because there are no institutions to check them. Somebody asked me, can an American president ever be an authoritarian? No. Flat out no. Because the founding fathers handled that problem. They created 2 houses of Congress, which now have 535 people, all of whom think they should be president. They created states with state houses with now 50 governors, most of whom think they should be president. They created courts up and down the system that will simply strike the president down if he is viewed to be unconstitutional. They created us, the American people, and our civil society that is just kind of ungovernable in a very major way. I think that we make a mistake when we think that outsized personalities in democracy will necessarily change governance. Now, there's no doubt that outsized personalities can be more persuasive. Roosevelt, for instance. They can rally their base, Trump, for instance. But I'm a great believer that in democracies, the ability to really do harm is significantly constrained. And while I think there's a little authoritarian envy out there among some of my colleagues these days, well, authoritarians, I mean, they get things done. They're efficient. Well, yes. They're also efficient at really bad policy. So the Chinese decide they're going to have a one-child policy a few years ago. They do it very efficiently, and now 34 million Chinese men don't have mates. Democracies sort of mess around, and it's kind of ineffective and kind of inefficient, but they're less likely to make really big mistakes. So I'll give you my favorite example of this in the current administration. So the president decides he's going to have a federal commission on electoral fraud, because he's sure that there's 17 million votes out there someplace that he got that people didn't count, right? So he's going to have electoral fraud. They go out for data to the states. The Secretary of State of Mississippi, the reddest state in the union, says, not my data. Whole thing falls apart. They have an idea that they're going to replace 1/3 of food stamps with food packages for poor people. And somebody honestly says, it's going to be kind of like Blue Apron. Right? Well, before it could get it, it was so ridiculed in the press, in the Congress. The agribusinesses started saying, you really think we're going to sell you subsidized food? Forget it. So I don't mean to suggest that it's a good thing that democracies have a hard time doing things, but it's better than doing things badly. And I think that multiple points of failure and multiple points of success, which characterizes more decentralized systems like our own, is much better than single points of failure and single points of success. China is about to have a real problem with this. Authoritarian regimes have two big Achilles heels. One is that they don't have peaceful transfer of power. The second is people stay too long, too many presidents for life. Now, the Chinese Communist Party had actually fixed that because they got term limits and they had age limits and they had collective leadership. There were at least two powerful people in the Chinese hierarchy, the premier who ran the economy and the president who ran everything else, and they were kind of co-equals. Xi Jinping has done away with that. And I think China's going to pay a price for having a single point of failure.
Makes sense. In today's world, there's a fair bit of, I would say, divisiveness around politics and a fair bit of polarization of the issues. I guess what role do you think that is playing in shaping policy? And also, is there a pathway to less divisiveness? And are there maybe some elements that are particularly concerning to you about the nature of our state of politics?
Well, look, I cite two things, and I don't, frankly, have a good notion of what to do about it. One is, obviously, we no longer have policy differences on anything. We seem to have constant differences of principle. Everything's dressed up as a matter of principle. That means I can't compromise because I would be compromising my values, when really it's just a policy dispute. And somehow, knowing the difference, we've lost the ability to know the difference. And I think that's why compromise becomes a bad word, and people in Washington feel they can't compromise and so forth. So that's a governance issue. The other is more of a cultural and societal issue. We have become an identity politics grievance culture. So we have become a culture in which my identity and my particular identity, whether it's racial or gender or sexual orientation or whatever, we have a hierarchy of grievance. And so my grievance is much more honorable and therefore to be valued than your grievance. And democracies can't survive that way. Because if it's not about a kind of common heritage or a common view or a common set of values, but everybody with their own grievance, everybody with their own narrative, it starts to pull people apart. And it was only a matter of time in that culture that populists were going to play to poor whites as an identity group. And now people are surprised that we have a kind of culture clash now. And by the way, elites are partly responsible for this. In the global, people who believe, as I do, in globalization, you know what I said in my book on democracy, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are back. Populism, nativism, protectionism, isolationism. They tend to run together. And the populist noted something that was going on in the society, which is that those of us who believe in globalization, and I do, believe that the international economy does not have to be zero-sum game, believe that we did a really great job of creating an international economy that was positive-sum game after World War II, never were quite able to admit that it didn't work for everybody, that there were pockets where, in a micro sense, it didn't work so well. The macro effects are observable, even to the point that China's a part of it. After they come out, the former countries of the Soviet Union are part of it. So no doubt in macro sense. But in a micro sense, a lot of places and a lot of people who didn't do very well. And those of us who believe in globalization are a little bit like people who are talking to somebody that doesn't speak your language. So if I'm speaking to somebody who only speaks German, I somehow think if I talk louder and slower, they're going to understand me. And that's how we sound. Don't you understand globalization is really good for you, Mr. Unemployed Coal Miner in West Virginia, or Mr. Steel Worker in Britain? And people are fighting back. A friend of mine called the election of 2016 the Do You Hear Me Now election. But you could have said that about Brexit. You could say that about the Five-Star Movement in Italy. And so those of us in the global elite, and we're all a part of it, just keep going right along. And by the way, parts of the global elite denigrating the values and the culture of those who are not a part of the global elite. And people got mad. And they decided to say, do you hear me now? And so we'd better have an answer pretty soon to that piece of it.
Are there other areas or countries that, for you, raise concern? We talk a lot about Russia, we talk a lot about China, Korea. What other countries are on your mind?
Oh, sure. Look, Iran is a big problem. The Iranians are a revisionist power in the Middle East. They don't particularly like the borders the way that they were drawn with Shia inside various other states. They are wreaking havoc in Lebanon through Hezbollah. They're wreaking havoc in Syria in their support of Bashar al-Assad. They're being challenged in Yemen, but the tensions between the Gulf states and the Iranians are a little bit scary from time to time. So yes, Iran is a big problem. Russia is a problem because the Russians are a declining power with almost nothing going for them except their military prowess and their ability to do things like interfere in people's elections. So they have no positive way to engage the international system, so they engage it as a destructive force. Yes, the rise of China is concerning, but I'm one who believes we'll be just fine in dealing with the rise of China if we don't try to out-Chinese the Chinese, but actually go ahead and invest in the things that have made this country leapfrog every innovation revolution. But frankly, I worry, we can handle all of that if the United States is confident at home and willing to engage. And so I worry more about American confidence today than I worry about any particular adversary.
In that context, how do you think about the role of soft power versus hard power, or more recently coined term of smart power?
Yeah, I've never much liked the distinction. My colleague Joe Nye is a really brilliant guy, and I know what he was driving at. But you really have to have the full range of assets at your disposal. So you cannot deal with the invasion of Crimea or a threat to the Swedish coastline or a threat to Article 5 of the NATO treaty with soft power. This doesn't work. You have to be able to scare the living daylights out of Vladimir Putin that if he goes too far, he will make a big mistake and Russia will pay. That's called hard power. You need it. Sometimes you are dealing from values and the attractiveness of your system. But that too has elements of not just, quote, soft power, but economic strength. Sometimes it is the ability to impose on others. So for instance, the United States of America has something through the Treasury, those of you who are bankers will know it, called 311 sanctions. So if the Treasury lists an Iranian entity, anybody who does business with that Iranian entity may not be able to do business in the United States. Is that soft power? No, that's coercive power. It's not military power, but it's coercive power. I want that in my toolkit. And yes, I think most American soft power is actually not in the hands of the government. It's in the hands of universities that have exchange students and send back people who become parts of other governments and always still remember their American family fondly. It's American sports and cultural stars who go abroad and they're remembered. That's where American soft power rests, and it's not in the government. And when I was secretary, people wanted us to do more public diplomacy. That's fine. But my answer to public diplomacy was go get Michelle Kwan, the great Chinese-American figure skater, send her to Beijing. She ends up on the cover of Sports Illustrated for China, and that's got more soft power than I could ever mobilize at the State Department. American business, operating abroad in ways that are honorable and that treat foreign workers as if they were American workers, that's a part of American soft power. I'll tell you a story in this regard. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, for whom I have enormous respect, the now former president of Liberia, said to President Bush at one point, "Mr. President, I want American companies in here." And he said, "Why?" And she said, "Because I know when my ministers sign a contract, the money's going to the contract, because you have this thing called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act." So the way that we do business abroad can be an element of soft power as well.
Do you have advice for US-based companies that are very global in nature in terms of how do they navigate these political unpredictability and choppy waters?
Yeah, well, it's hard. Just wrote this book on political risk, and we used to think of political risk as, you know, Hugo Chavez is going to nationalize your land or your assets. Doesn't happen very much anymore. A little bit in the Philippines, but for the most part not. But I would say pay attention to the transnational character of civil society, for instance. If you have a factory in Bangladesh that is not safe, that will not just be an issue in Bangladesh, it will be an issue with transnational civil society. If you are spewing pollutants into the air in Cameroon, that will not just be a problem in Cameroon, that will be a problem with environmental groups transnationally. So best to treat their environment, their workforce, like you would act within the United States. I don't mean wages, I understand that, but I do mean the treatment of people. And by the way, to be a part also of the answer to Do You Hear Me Now? Because, you know, the answer to Do You Hear Me Now has to do with human potential development. Can't have any more third graders who can't read. Can't have any more 18-year-olds who come out, go to college, take down debt, and don't have usable skills. So the experiments companies are doing of working with community colleges, for instance, to give people skills that actually have a job on the other end, very important. Can't have any more 35-year-olds who can't be retrained and retrained and retrained because the job profile keeps changing. And by the way, before you automate your workforce out of existence, how about thinking about how to retrain those people to the higher level work that's going to be. So I think the social responsibility issues are quite important for companies both at home and abroad.
You're making me concerned about my undergraduate philosophy degree, which is not perhaps a usable skill.
It's all right, you've got a job, it's okay. Yeah.
Maybe a different issue. I do want to turn to maybe a little bit more of the sort of personal side of your story. You've been a trailblazer as a woman of color in amazing positions. Can you talk a little bit about sort of lessons you want to impart or advice you have for other women or people of color in terms of pursuing opportunities that you've been able to be so successful in?
Well, I have to preface it by saying I grew up a little bit differently. I grew up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. I often tell people I don't get microaggression, that was macroaggression. And so I grew up with parents who had me convinced that I might not be able to have a hamburger at the Woolworth's lunch counter, but I could be president of the United States if I wanted to be. And so they had kind of three mantras that they and their friends imparted. The first was, you have to be twice as good, right? So they didn't say that as a matter of debate. They said that as a matter of fact. So we all went about trying to be twice as good. And if you work to be twice as good, then you're confident because you know you've worked very hard. The second was, you cannot ever consider yourself a victim, because once you say you're a victim, you've given control of your life to somebody else. You may not be able to control your circumstances, but you can control your response to your circumstances. So don't even think about that. And then the third was one that my father had, and I didn't understand it until many years later. I'd come home from something, and somebody didn't want to sit next to me because I was black. And my father said, you know, it's just fine if they don't want to sit next to you because you're black, as long as they move. Right? So what he was saying was, don't take somebody else's prejudice as upon yourself, and don't be somehow knocked down by somebody else's prejudice. There will be jerks in the room. There will be jerks in the world. Learn to deal with them and be pretty tough about it. And so I admit that that particular upbringing made me probably thicker-skinned than a lot of people, and I understand that. That it made me more forcefully aggressive about it. I remember once going into a store with my mother, and the woman said, my mother asked to see some nice sweaters. And the woman showed her the sweaters, and she said, no, 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 I'd like some that are, you know, natural fabrics. And the woman said, well, those are very expensive. And my mother said, let's get this straight. If you could afford anything in here, you wouldn't be working here. Right? So that's how I grew up, right? I grew up sharp-tongued. I grew up fighting back. I grew up that way. So most of the time, when I encountered something, I said to people, do you have a problem with me? Now, it's not always that easy, and I recognize that. And I say to people who are different, my godson is going through this. He's playing AAU basketball. He's 6'9". He's going to be a college player. He's playing for the Oakland Soldiers. He's the only white kid on the team. So I'm saying, okay, Neil, this. I've been there. You know, I know this. So, but if you're different, sometimes you need people to help you navigate it. And the other thing I had throughout my life was I had great mentors. People who saw things in me that I didn't see in myself. Joseph Corbell, Madeleine Albright's father, when I was a failed piano major, he convinced me that I could actually be a Soviet specialist and a professor. Brent Scowcroft, who met me as a young faculty member, started taking me to the Aspen Strategy Group, introduced me to the foreign policy community. That's how I ended up in government. George H.W. Bush, who when we first met Gorbachev, said, this is Professor Condoleezza Rice. She's from Stanford. She's my Soviet specialist. She tells me everything I know about the Soviet Union. Gorbachev mumbled something like, well, I hope she knows a lot. But you know what he was doing? It wasn't just Gorbachev who heard that. It was everybody else who heard that. And so great mentors can make a huge difference in easing you into circumstances in which you're different. But there's also an important story in that. If I had been waiting for a black female Soviet specialist role model, I'd still be waiting, right? And my mentors were white men. They were old white men. That's who dominated my field. And so find your mentors, not that they look like you. It's great if they do, but if they don't, just find people who are going to advocate for you and see things in you that you don't see in yourself. And remember that mentorship is a two-way street. You have to earn it.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Dr. Rice. It's been fantastic having you.